What's good, Dungeoneers? Your boy Jesse Juggles is back with another D&D update. Over the last couple of months we've been getting more and more details about changes from 5th edition to what's not quite 6th edition, branded as 1D&D. Amongst the news has been information regarding how they're updating each character class in the new Player's Handbook. So far we've received at least some news on all classes, and while some changes have been relatively minor, others have had quite significant overhauls with much needed updates. Now Jesse's coming to a lot of this news later than most of the bigger tabletop gaming channels. However, with this added time, we've got further clarity on some of the initial big questions. Some of the more provocative changes have settled for us to look at objectively, and we've also got some insight on some of the additional rumours that have popped up within the last week or so that could impact a couple of classes rather drastically. While we won't cover every minor detail, let's cover the major class changes you'll be seeing in your transition from 5e to 1D&D. In no particular order, we'll first start off by looking at the fighter. Fighters have had the reputation as the most basic, and it appears that 1D&D's goal with the new fighter is to combat some of those critiques by improving what was already there and diversifying their options. Outside of the inclusion of weapon mastery, which we'll cover a little bit later as many of the martial classes gain access to this ability, the most significant change to the fighter is the new rendition of Second Wind. You'll now have more uses of Second Wind per day, heal more than you did previously, and when activating it, you can add a bonus effect. Strangely enough, it seems that they have taken the wind part of Second Wind more literally. On top of the healing, your choices when using Second Wind are free movement that's immune to opportunity attacks, a 5-foot radial blast of air, potentially pushing enemies back, what's essentially a more powerful gust cantrip attack to one enemy, a small controlled air current to catch yourself during a fall, a bonus d6 buff of bludgeoning damage to your next round of attacks, or the utility of a bonus to perception for the next 10 minutes. While interesting and unique, the once super broad interpretal fighter is now slightly more specific with what's basically airbending. However, a lot of these ideas are simple enough that you could work with your DM to reflavor these with relative ease. Our first caster for discussion is the Sorcerer, and for good reason. Bulk of the class's features went largely unchanged, but had one crucial and fundamental difference. Sorcerers are no longer charisma casters, but instead constitution casters. On one hand, the sorcerer's constitution being the source of their power makes some sense. Sorcerers are physically imbued with some sort of innate magic, a natural gift, or curse. They may have a powerful bloodline, be the product of a magical experiment gone wrong, or have otherwise had their physical form forever changed by some otherworldly force. So for lore purposes, it would make sense that one's physicality, their fortitude, their constitution, would have an impact on their arcane potential. The healthier the body, the stronger the magic. The other argument for it is gameplay variety. While all very different, both the Warlock and the half-casting Paladin use Charisma for their spellcasting, so assigning Sorcerer to Constitution mixes things up. The downside to all of that is that never before has a 5e class only needed one good ability score to the extent that the new Sorcerer does. Constitution was always a good backup for all classes, and now by making it their primary source of all their class features on top of it already being their source of health and magical concentration, sorcerers may start to look a little overpowered compared to their other casting counterparts. The ideal sorcerer's ability scores may go from looking something like this to more like this. Next, we'll look at the Rogue. Ignoring weapon mastery for now, the biggest unique inclusion to the Rogue's toolkit is Cunning Strike. When a rogue would deal sneak attack damage, it can instead substitute 1d6 of that damage for an additional effect. Now this isn't a totally new concept, it's been thrown around in UA previously, it's been a trend in Homebrew, and it's been featured in modified rogue-esque classes for overhauled 5e systems like Star Wars 5e. From the handbook, the effect list includes a chance to disarm, chance to poison, tripping, shoving, grappling, attempting to daze or blind, moving without opportunity attack, observe, steal, defend, offend, apprehend, suspend, dividend, recommend, befriend, flirt, kiss, boogie down, and more. It appears from leaks that we didn't receive the full list of Cunning Strike options, but those already mentioned should definitely bring a wider range of options to rogues, especially those trying for skill monkey builds. When looking at the new wizard class page, you might have a hard time trying to identify what's new. but aside from a couple of minor tweaks here and there, there's no fundamental changes to the wizard. That is, until you look at the subclasses. Previously, 2014's player handbook for 5e included 8 wizard subclasses total, one named and based for each of D&D's 8 schools of magic. This contrasted drastically with some classes, like the 2014 Barbarian, who only had access to 2 subclasses at the time. Now for the 2024 handbook, all classes will have 4 subclasses each, and while this is a step up for many of them, the wizard has lost a lot. WotC's solution to narrowing down 8 into 4 was to create 4 new subclasses, each one combining aspects of 2 schools of magic. The consequences of this decision means that each new subclass excels when learning, copying, and casting from 2 schools of magic instead of 1. However, the subclasses have also had to choose between, and therefore removed some of the higher level subclass features. Those that favour the Conjuration Wizard will probably like the increased options that the Transmutation school provides, but will lack the highly specialised capacity to summon that the original Conjurer had. The new subclasses are as follows. The schools of Abjuration and Evocation are now under the School of Conflict. The schools of Conjuration and Transmutation are now under the School of Reconstruction. The schools of Divination and Necromancy are now under the School of Presence. And the schools of Enchantment and Illusion are now under the School of Cheeky Shenanigans. All school names are subject to change. Now there's no news as to whether we'll get new versions of the original schools of magic, or whether we'll get different pairing combinations across the schools of magic, or whether future wizard classes will have focuses outside of the 8 main schools, like War Magic and Blade Singers. But considering the old 5e subclasses fit relatively seamlessly with the new 1D&D wizard, players and DMs shouldn't have a hard time for choice, even if they dislike the new options. Bard's class changes were mostly about getting features 1 or 2 levels earlier than you would in 5th edition. Aside from this, Bardic Inspiration was tweaked to be more powerful, but more specific, and could be seen as a buff or a nerf depending on your perspective. The previous dice size increased by levels as per this table, but will now follow this table. Additionally, the number of inspiration dice available to you before a long rest expands to your charisma modifier plus your proficiency bonus. Previously it was only the modifier. What's specific, however, is the now limited use cases for inspiration. Previously, inspiration could be used on any ability check, attack roll, or saving throw. Now it can only be used in these situations. Saving throws of which you aren't already proficient, attack rolls with a melee weapon, damage rolls with a non-magical weapon, spell attacks by intelligence or charisma based casters, and ability checks to do one of the following. Grapple, shove, stealth, sing, play an instrument, play a gaming set, gambling, pranking, balance multiple items at once, perform an epic trick shot, construct a Rube Goldberg machine, arm wrestle, thumb wrestle, flirt, kiss, or boogie down. And while not available to us until we see the proper PHB, it's now been confirmed that further uses for Bardic Inspiration will open up depending on the subclass you choose. Most updates for the Druid can be seen in and around their Wild Shape ability. First, all Druids can Wild Shape as a bonus action now. In 5e this was exclusive to the Circle of the Moon subclass. You start off with 2 uses at base, scaling up to 4 uses by level 17, you regain 1 use on a short rest and all uses on a long rest. But the biggest change to Wild Shape is a result of the restructured categorization of creatures. Instead of using Wild Shape to turn into a beast of your choice, you now instead turn into an animal. What looks like an attempt to interpret a more scientific, real-world, evolutionary perspective of a fantasy setting, the humanoid and beast creature types have been merged into the animal creature type. This is one of 2 creature type mergers to simplify the game. Aberrations, monstrosities, and oozes have also been merged now as abominations. As a result, technically any druid can now transform into a humanoid race of their choosing, albeit with no items or clothing. This could be exploited to turn into oneself, dubbed by the community as an instant nude button. Note that you currently can't turn into all player races, as people like fairies and changelings are still considered fae, not animals. While looking through their class features, the cleric is another that seems predominantly untouched in the new 1D&D system, that is, unless you read the very first few paragraphs. In a super bold decision, the class has been restricted, and can only be played by those who practice some sort of religion in real life. This is especially shocking when considering the player base and online vocal audience of modern D&D, which appear to be mostly agnostic, atheist, and/or progressive. Some are speculating this decision to be a result of a progressively political overstep. Portraying a character with a religious background without having one yourself could be seen as cultural appropriation. The obvious conflict with this theory is that the common religious groups within the Western-dominant D&D audience are completely different to the fictional polytheist religions found in most campaign settings. Now, old Jesse here thinks that this is much more likely to be the result of the creators knowing the overpowered strength of healing in their game. They recognise the cleric to be the best means of healing in D&D, and acknowledge the cleric to be the overpowered class that it is. Instead of removing it altogether, they decided to limit access to the relative minority within their audience, God-fearing folk. However, this decision will definitely create more bad press for Wizards of the Coast, and the ruling will likely be ignored. In contrast, 1D&D took a different approach when restricting paladins. As with many other aspects of the updated game system, a more literal interpretation of previous ideas was implemented. Paladin oaths are how those who take up the class gain access to their divine power, and to break their oath is a rejection of their abilities. It also appears that one individual can't take up multiple oaths, or that's at least what players are being told. Yes, while not restricted by player demographics like clerics, players are now restricted from playing multiple paladins at the one time across different campaigns. This decision seems to be a means of not breaking oaths cross-campaign, further blurring the lines between RP and reality, and making playing a paladin a serious commitment. A warlock's relationship with their source of power is different again. Warlocks aren't victims to the above-table restrictions like clerics or paladins, but their biggest change also comes from how their warlock pacts are now interpreted. Instead, within their worlds, warlock pacts and contracts are now legally binding. The governing bodies of your D&D setting will now be tracking agreements made between you and your patron. Be it fines, prison time, or community service, a failure to live up to your supernatural pact may result in the much more grounded law enforcement coming after you and your party. For the Artificer? No, I'm just kidding, Watsy doesn't care about the Artificer. Barbarians, for the longest time, have been set apart from the rest due to their tank status, a result of their ability to rage. However, Wizards of the Coast are now wanting to give this class more variety in their features, and be more than a one-note emotional beast. So alongside Weapon Mastery, which will be covered later on, instead of just being able to rage, rage will now be one option out of many in their new class feature, the Emotional Outburst. And despite its name, this should give barbarians more control than ever before. Note that all of these options maintain the resistances of the original rage. Picking two options at level 1 and gaining more with higher levels, your emotional outburst choices are as follows. Rage is essentially the same as 5e's Barbarian Rage. Fear gives attack rolls above a certain threshold the chance to give the frightened condition to your opponents, and ending this outburst early can force enemies within 30 feet to all make a wisdom save or become frightened. Courage gives you immunity to the frightened condition and gain a d4 to all ability checks and attack rolls. The dice size will change over time. Greed will provide a 30-foot radius to covet and gain positive statuses and spell effects from your enemies. Compassion gives you the ability to transfer damage, conditions, and negative spell effects from your allies onto yourself. Hope effectively grants the luck feat for a minute, and you have a number of hope dice, which are essentially luck points, up to your proficiency bonus. You can use these dice on yourself and allies within 15 feet, or enemies within 5 feet. And love grants you the ability to flirt, kiss, and boogie down as additional bonus actions to give further conditions to your opponents. Now, those familiar with DC's Green Lantern characters and their emotional spectrum may have noticed that the options available here closely mirror that of DC's Lantern Corps. These emotional abilities have also been color-coded within the player's handbook, mostly switched around from their DC counterparts, likely so they don't get sued. DC Comics, at least to Jesse here, seems like a strange source of inspiration for a D&D class, but the utility looks good for those wanting to try out the new Barbarian. Almost reached the end now, but before we get there, we first have to go back. About 18 months back now, Wizards of the Coast put out a community survey, asking for feedback on the current state of D&D so that they can improve it in the future. One of the questions was which class was the worst and why. Those results have become public now, so we can see which subclasses were received the worst. While the reasoning why varied greatly, the Who became a tough race to the bottom between the Monk and the Ranger. Ultimately, the stats showed that the Monk is the worst class in 5th edition D&D, or at least the one that people like the least. So instead of giving the class a large makeover like some of the others, the logical course of action by WotC was to scrap the class altogether. There will be no Monk in 1D&D. However, there are rumours that a new class will be filling the martial artist gap that the Monk used to lie in, and will be released in an expansion book late next year. So all that leaves us with is the Ranger. Not thrown out like the Monk, but many changes have been had. Little remains of the Ranger from 5th edition, and what rose from those ashes is almost unrecognisable. Over the years, WotC has taken some more experimental partnerships across with other media franchises, with some of their other products. The most divisive of these have been the various crossovers introduced with their card game Magic the Gathering. Brands like Stranger Things, Street Fighter, and Doctor Who have all had their own cards put into the game. This style of branded crossover has now made its way into D&D, and lacks any subtlety. Yes, that's right, the Ranger class has now been reworked completely into a Fortnite collaboration. Aside from weapon mastery, the new Ranger will get a range of magical abilities themed around Fortnite items to choose from, getting more at higher levels. Such items include a slow-falling arcane glider, a spectral pickaxe akin to the cleric's spiritual weapon, slurp juice potions granting temporary HP, a car, an enhanced buff to a ranged weapon, and a temporary structure of domain similar to the Portafort. New Ranger subclasses include the Defaulter's Guard, the Ursine Grappler, the Marine Warden, and Travis Scott. So that covers all the basics for class updates coming to 1D&D. Don't forget to smash all the right buttons down below so your boy Jesse can flex more new cards on his Instagram. Peace.